It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I think it's very important for people to understand what they're exposed to in the environment, especially if our government is failing to protect us. And I think in this particular case, it is failing. It's failing badly. And so what I would like to do today is share with you some of my understanding of the research that's been done on electromagnetic radiation, some of the harmful effects to humans. And I understand that at the end of this, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. I'd also like to say there's someone very special in the audience today. It's Dr. Martin Blank. Martin, could I get you to just stand up for a minute? Dr. Blank has been doing research. He's been doing research in this area far longer than I. He's a lot older than I am too, I'm sure. He's recently retired from Columbia University, and I understand he's spending part of his time here on Vancouver Island. So you're very lucky, I think, to have him amongst you. He's extremely knowledgeable. He's done a lot of research on stress proteins, and he very kindly offered to answer some questions at the end if there are any that are addressed to him. Okay, so thank you very much, Martin, for Dr. Blank for coming. I'm going to show you a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm just going to set it up. Today we have a public forum. The title I was given is Cell Transmission Towers and Your Health. However, I would like to suggest that another name for tonight's talk is Pass the Buck versus The Buck Stops Here. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today. My outline for tonight, I'm going to give you a primer on electromagnetic energy, just so that we are all talking about the same thing. I'm going to share with you some scientific studies that relate to health, just a few of them because of the amount of time we have. I was asked to keep my talk down to 30 minutes, and I'll try to do that. I'm going to share with you some of the guidelines we have here in Canada, how they were devised, and how they compare to guidelines around the world. And then I'm going to make some recommendations at the end. First of all, we're going to talk about electromagnetic energy. And one of the things you can see here is that we have a lot of devices that we've used starting from the turn of the 1900s until present that use electromagnetic energy in one form or another. And this timeline has been increasing exponentially. The number of products we have now that we had 50, 100 years ago, it's just astronomically high now. And so our exposure is increasing along with the technology that we're using. Every single invention on this particular slide has been associated with some adverse health effect, from electrocution with electricity all the way up to cancers and miscarriages. And one of the symptoms that we're experiencing today is up in the top right-hand corner here. I'm going to get my cursor working so I can point to a few of these things. Up in the top right-hand corner, I have EHS. EHS stands for electro-hypersensitivity. All of us are electrical beings. All of us are sensitive to electromagnetic energy. Some of us are more sensitive than others, and these people called electrically hypersensitive. Some of the devices that I also have up here in this upper right-hand corner, I have something here called smart meters. Now, is there anyone here who doesn't know what a smart meter is? Okay. Something else, RFID, radio frequency identification devices. Does anyone not know what they are? Okay. Wi-Fi and WiMAX. Is there anyone here who doesn't know what those are? Okay, good. Those are the questions that you can ask when we go into the question period. Okay, we've got a huge number of technologies that are coming on the market that are currently being used, that are spreading, and these all require wireless technology. So it's not just television and radio and cell phones. It's much, much more than that. And one of the key questions that I think we need to address is what are the long-term health effects of this technology that we're exposed to? When we're talking about the electromagnetic spectrum, we're talking about a range of frequencies with very low frequencies down here at the bottom. These are called extremely low frequencies. Scientists give names to different frequency bands so that we can talk about them more easily. We have another band here that's called radio frequency. It goes up to infrared, visible light. And then we enter a part of the spectrum that's called ionizing radiation. And these very high frequencies include cosmic radiation, X-rays, ultraviolet energy, and we know that this form of energy is harmful. There's absolutely no controversy about the harmful effects of this part of the spectrum. Interestingly, we have a part of the spectrum that's called radio frequency. It overlaps with something we call microwaves and radar. So when we're talking about microwave energy, we're talking about high radio frequencies. When we're talking about radio frequencies, we may or may not be talking about microwaves. So just a little bit of a distinction here so that once again, we're all talking about the same thing. Now, there are three parts of the spectrum that have health effects associated with them. In the ionizing band, there's ionization that takes place, which means there's changes in atoms in your body. The electrons are displaced from atoms, and this causes all sorts of adverse effects. And we have excellent guidelines for ionization. We have another part of the spectrum that's called thermal, that's dealing with thermal energy, and we have very good, not excellent, we have very good thermal guidelines. What that means is that if you're exposed to microwave radiation, the levels that we have for Safety Code 6 in Canada will protect you. Your body will not heat up at the levels that have been set. Now, there's another part of the spectrum about which there's quite a bit of controversy, and that's down here. And this is the non-thermal or the biological effects range. And there are some physicists who will tell you that there is no such thing as non-thermal effects from this energy. What I'd like to show tonight is that there are non-thermal effects, and I'm going to document what some of these are. We have no guidelines in Canada that deal with non-thermal biological effects. So as long as the radiation does not heat your body tissue, it's deemed to be safe by Health Canada. What are the reasons for having no guidelines for non-thermal effects? Well, if you talk to the scientists at either Health Canada or the World Health Organization or other international bodies, they will tell you there's no scientific evidence of non-thermal effects. And indeed, they will look at the research and try to show, well, that was really a thermal effect. You really had heating taking place. Or they will say there's no credible scientific evidence. Credibility is very much an opinion. So who decides what's credible and what isn't? Or they will say there's no conclusive scientific evidence. Once again, whether it's conclusive or not depends on the weight of evidence. Or they'll say there's no known mechanism. Well, all of these statements are false. Sometimes what Health Canada will say is that yes, of course, there are biological effects, but there aren't any health effects, so they begin to use semantics. And so when you deal with these scientists, it's incredibly frustrating because they fail to take into account all of the research that's been done in this area. They simply say it's not credible or it's not conclusive when there have been thousands, literally thousands of research documents showing adverse biological and adverse health effects. Now, the reason for not having these biological effects prompted a group of international scientists. Dr. Martin Blank, who I introduced just a few minutes ago, was one of the authors for this particular report. It's called the Bioinitiative Report. It came out last year, and all these scientists are asking for is that we have guidelines that protect us against these non-thermal biological effects. That's the only thing that they're asking. The document is quite long. It's available online, free of charge, so you can download it. There's a website there, www.bioinitiatives.com. And this particular report has over 2,000 papers documenting these adverse effects that Health Canada simply fails to recognize. So really what this group of scientists are saying is the buck stops here. We have the evidence, now act on it. The areas that we're concerned about tonight are in the radio wave band. We're talking about FM radio transmission for televisions, for example, and we're also talking about cell phone transmissions because there are a number of towers that impact the residents in this particular area. So this is the band of the spectrum we're talking about, and it's a band that overlaps with both thermal and non-thermal effects. Now, if we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, it's very difficult for people to understand how waves function, particularly microwaves. And so when I teach a course to my students, I introduce them to the concept of light. We're all familiar with light, and so we use something that we're familiar with. And the way that microwaves function is very similar to the way that light functions. And so we know, for example, that light can be transmitted through certain objects, windows, for example. It can be reflected off of mirrors. It can be focused with proper magnification glasses. It can be absorbed. So all of these things can happen to microwave energy as well. One of the reasons you can use your cell phone inside the building is because it penetrates the building. This radiation can actually go through walls. It penetrates this material. So walls are like windows to light for microwave radiation. It can be reflected, and one of the best objects to reflect this energy is metal. And so if you happen to be standing by something that's metallic, and you've got microwaves in the area, they will actually bounce off something that's metallic or be re-radiated from the metallic object. They can be absorbed, and one of the best absorbers are the things that we put in microwave ovens, which is what? Water and fat. And that's what we consist of, water, fat, protein. And so being exposed to this means that our bodies are readily absorbing microwave radiation. Now, in real terms, what does that mean? It means if you wear wired rimmed glasses, if you have a pacemaker, if you're wearing clothing with zippers or other metal fasteners, if you have any kind of metallic implants, this metal is going to reflect microwave energy. And indeed, people who have metal implants, if they're exposed to microwaves, what they will tell you is that that part of their body heats up. We know not to put anything metallic into a microwave oven because it will spark and it will heat up and it can possibly cause a fire. Similarly with things like metal fillings, the people who are becoming most sensitive to this form of energy are those who have metal amalgam. And I'm not talking about only mercury. If you happen to have gold or any kind of other metal in your mouth for braces or anything else, that's going to reflect the radiation I'm talking about. Jewelry. People who have become electrically sensitive have difficulty wearing jewelry because they develop a rash around where that jewelry is. Underwire bras, once again, they're in a perfect shape to actually magnify the microwave radiation right into the breast tissue. And we know that women in Canada, 1 out of 9 of them, will develop breast cancer within their lifetime, which is an absolutely abhorrent number. Now, I don't want to give the impression that microwave energy is producing breast cancer, the high rate of breast cancer, but it could be one of the things that's contributing to breast cancer among women who have large breasts and wear that underwire to support the breast tissue. Now, the two sources of microwave energy, indeed radio frequencies that we're exposed to, come from either outside of the home. They come from broadcast or radar antennas. Broadcast refers to anything like television or radio. Cell phone antennas, and Wi-Fi or WiMAX. Now, this type of antenna is something that we're using more and more in cities to allow people to use their computer in a wireless fashion. So if you want to connect to an internet without having to plug it into a wired modem, you can actually be sitting out in a park in certain cities and you can connect, read your email or surf the World Wide Web because there are Wi-Fi antennas around. Starbucks has them, a lot of airports have them, a lot of hotels now have them as well. The other source that I'd like to draw your attention to, I know most of the people here tonight are concerned about the antennas outside their home, but there are sources within your home that you should be concerned about as well. If you have cordless phones in your home, for example, there's one particular brand of cordless phone. It's called a DECT phone, D-E-C-T, which originally stood for Digital European Cordless Telephony. It's a phone that radiates whether or not you're using it or not. As soon as you plug it into the socket in your home, it's on full power and it gives off very high levels of radiation. We've recently submitted a petition to Health Canada, to the Auditor General of Canada to ask Health Canada to deem them unsafe and to ban them in Canada, and indeed they should be banned worldwide. There's another type of technology that I'd like to draw your attention to. It's not related to antennas, but it's so important that I'm trying to just get the message out to people. Many of us care about the environment. We want to go as green as possible, and we're encouraged by governments around the world to use energy-efficient light bulbs. The types of light bulbs that are currently available that are affordable are the compact fluorescent light bulbs, the squiggly ones that most of us are now buying. They are deadly. They contain mercury, and as soon as they're broken or sent to a landfill site, the mercury gets into the environment. Indeed, if you happen to have one and if you break it in your house, I suggest you go to the EPA webpage. They will tell you how to clean it up, and believe me, it's not simple. And that's just one of the reasons I think these lights should be banned, which has nothing to do with antennas. But they also produce radio frequency radiation. They produce ultraviolet radiation. They've caused problems, skin problems for people who have sensitive skin. And they produce something called dirty electricity, and they're making people sick. When people remove these light bulbs from their homes, a lot of their symptoms go away, and that includes back pain, headaches, difficulty concentrating, some of the other symptoms that I'll be talking about later on. So although I realize this is off topic, it's something that I think is so important that people really just have to know about it. So if you've recently purchased these energy efficient light bulbs, and if you have any health concerns, what I'm recommending for people to do is simply for 1 week, get rid of them, take them out, and monitor your health. If your health doesn't improve, then chances are you're not sensitive, but if your health improves, then get rid of the light bulbs. And don't throw them out because they contain mercury. Take them back to the store where you bought them and ask them to dispose of them safely. Okay, now I'm back on topic again. Okay, if you're exposed to radiation from an antenna that's outside your home, that radiation is going to come in, and it's going to come in primarily through your windows. Your windows are much more permeable than walls, for example. And as I mentioned, metallic objects reflect it. So if you happen to have a filing cabinet, if you're in an office and you have a filing cabinet and the radiation's coming in through your window, it's going to reflect off that filing cabinet, and you can be exposed depending on where you're sitting in relationship to the source of radiation. Similarly, if it's coming from the other side of the filing cabinet is going to protect you. So metallic objects in your house, whether they're things behind the walls or things that you have on the other side of the wall, the same side of the wall you're on, it's going to increase your exposure. Now, we talk about towers and we talk about antennas, and not everyone realizes there's a difference between these two terms. A tower is simply a structure that holds something up. In this case, the tower is holding antennas. So this is what a tower would look like. This picture was taken in Toronto, and this is what the antennas look like on that particular tower. At one stage, I counted them, and I think there were over 20 antennas on this particular tower. This is a high voltage transmission line. It's also a tower. And one of the things the cell phone industry is now beginning to do is they're beginning to put antennas onto high voltage transmission lines. And there are 4 of them here. They look like rectangles right up here. Now, towers have become vertical real estate for antennas. As soon as you have a tower on, you can make a lot of money by renting it out to antennas. And indeed, if you allow a tower on your property, then you can make quite a bit of money. Wires can also act like antennas. So the fact that they're beginning to put them on high voltage transmission lines is not a good thing because these wires can re-radiate the energy, and they can cost you quite a bit of money. And I'm going to give you 3 very short examples of this. I was in Bermuda a few years ago. The island of Bermuda has a population of about 70,000. I come from Peterborough, Ontario, and that has a population of about 70,000. So it was kind of interesting to me to see a country that, has the same population as the city I live in. And they were very concerned about antennas on their island. And so a colleague and I went down there, and we were showing people, local people, how to do measurements on the island because they wanted to basically protect the health of the people on the island. And this friend of mine, his name is Dave Stetzer. He's a power quality expert. He's an electrician by trade. And he was in the US military where he worked on radar. He actually repaired radar equipment. And so he has a very good background in radio frequencies. We went down to the island and we were waiting to meet some of our colleagues down there, and Dave was in my sitting room at the hotel that we were staying at, and he was sitting in this chair, sitting right next to a brass lamp, and he began to feel quite ill. Now, Dave has developed electrical sensitivity, and when he told me he wasn't feeling well, I'm a very empathetic person, and I said, "Oh great, what do you think it is?" Expecting expecting something to be in the environment, in that particular environment that was affecting him. And since we had all the equipment, I thought, this is absolutely wonderful. We can find out what's affecting you. And as we're teaching some of our friends in Bermuda how to do the measurements, we can get and then use it as a teaching tool. I don't think he was all that amused by this. But anyway, we began to take out our equipment, and I took out one piece of equipment, which is a directional antenna, so it tells you where the radiation is coming from. And we found out there was some sort of antenna kitty corner to the room that we were in. And we went out on the balcony, had a look, and yes, we could see the top of that particular antenna. He took out another piece of equipment. He said, I don't think that's it. He said, I think it's related to this lamp I'm sitting next to. I mentioned it's a brass lamp, and so once again we were thinking maybe the metal was acting like an antenna and re-radiating the energy. So we took out another meter, and we found high frequencies coming off of the lamp. Well, this is kind of interesting. I actually, when he was holding the meter, pointing it towards the lamp, I remember sort of bending over to have a look at the values, and the reading went down. And I moved away, and the reading went up, and I moved closer, and it went down. I thought, I said, that's really interesting. I said, I must be blocking it. He said, no. He said, you're absorbing this energy. Well, it turns out that when he measured the electrical cord, all of that was radiating. As soon as we unplugged it, the radiation went away. So the lamp wasn't acting like an antenna. The entire electrical system in that building was acting like an antenna. He even pointed it to the bed where I was sleeping, and it was re-radiating high frequencies. Now, what on earth could re-radiate from a bed? Well, you've got the coils, the bed springs. And when he was doing these readings, he was measuring the high frequency electric field coming off the bed. I moved my knee, and I just touched the bed with my knee, and the readings went down. What was happening is that they were actually going through my body. So why do people have a difficult time sleeping if they're exposed to this form of energy? Because they're sleeping on a bed probably that has a mattress with coils in it, and they're re-radiating, and they're being exposed all night long. He took out another meter, and this time we were able to measure the frequency, and we found out that the antenna that we were picking up on the wire was a radio station, 103 FM, 103 megahertz on the dial. Another example, when this form of energy actually gets onto the electricity, it's called dirty electricity. It interferes with your power quality. That's what I do research in, and I'm just going to show you one example that I think is very dramatic of what can happen when this form of energy gets onto the wires. One of the groups of people I work with are people who have multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a nervous disorder, and we think that this form of energy affects the nerves in a very profound way. And as I was working with people with MS, we were getting remarkable results when we cleaned up the dirty electricity in their home. And I went to this one home, and I began to videotape people because I thought no one's going to believe the results we're getting. And so I videotaped this one woman. She's 40 years old. She has progressive MS, and when I was talking to her, she was sitting on her hands. And I asked her, I said, why are you sitting on your hands? She says, because they shake. And I said, would you mind, holding them out, holding them as still as you possibly can while I videotape them? And she agreed. Now, the levels of dirty electricity, by the way, in her home were down here, about 148 to 2,000, which is very, very high. This is the meter I used to measure the dirty electricity. The levels in this room are over 2,000. They've been linked to cancers in a recent study, and I'm actually contributing to the dirty electricity in here, by the way, with the equipment I'm using. They've recently been linked to cancer clusters among teachers in a school in California. Okay, I asked her to hold her hands out, and she's holding them as straight as she possibly can. Her mother's moved back in with her to feed her because she can't feed herself. Her husband takes care of her during the night, and her mother takes care of her during the day. We cleaned up the dirty electricity in our home. We got the levels quite low, and these are the types of filters that you plug into your house to clean them up, by the way. And 6 weeks later, I asked her to hold her hands out again, and this is what you can see. Now, there's absolutely no difference in anything. There was no difference in the medication she was taking, and you can see just a huge difference. And this is the kind of results we're getting with people who have neurological disorders. So if you happen to be living near cell phone or radio or television transmitter antennas, it's very important to find out whether or not that energy is actually getting on the wiring in your home. Now, some of the people that I've met today told me that sometimes when they're using the phone, they suddenly hear a radio station coming through the line. This shouldn't happen. It means that your line, the station hasn't properly filtered their transmitters, and it's getting onto the wiring. So this is really, really important that you get rid of this. Okay. What about my third story is actually going to be what it might cost you if you happen to have dirty electricity coming in on your wires. I worked with a woman in New York State who was electrically sensitive, and just by chance she told me that her electricity bill had just skyrocketed, and she thought it related to the latest cell phone tower that was placed in her neighborhood. And one of the things that's at the base of any kind of antenna installation is their electrical housing. This is where they connect to the grid. And this is where they would filter any kind of radiation to make sure it doesn't get onto wires. On the side of your house, you have something called an hour-watt meter, and this tells the utility how much electricity you're using. And they're going from mechanical hour-watt meters now to digital ones. But with the original hour-watt meters, they're designed for 60 cycles, which is what your electricity comes at, 60-cycle frequency. If you start having higher frequencies on your wire, what that will do is it'll make the hour-watt meter spin more quickly. Okay? If it's spinning more quickly, it's telling the utility that you're using more energy, and so your bill goes up. So we looked at the data she had. She kept all of her bills. She was electrically sensitive, so she didn't have a computer or an air conditioner. She used fans, and she really didn't use that much electricity. Her annual bill before the antennas were placed in her neighborhood was $1,400 for electricity. Once the antennas came in, her annual bill rose to $2,400. She went to the electrical utility and said, there must be something wrong. I haven't done anything different. The price hasn't gone up for electricity. I don't understand what's causing the problem. And what they said, it's not our fault. Talk to the cell phone industry. She went to the cell phone industry, complained there, and they said, it's not our fault. It's your utility bill. Go to the electrical industry. Basically, what they were doing is passing the buck. In order to determine whether this was indeed a high-frequency problem, we got her husband to put chokes on the hour-watt meter. And as soon as they choked the high frequencies coming into the house, her electricity bill dropped down to about $1,800. So we know it was high frequencies making the meter spin incorrectly. Okay, if you have an antenna, it will bounce, it will reflect off of objects. So the closer you stand to a wall, the higher the reflection will be. There will also be a certain amount of reflection off of the ground. But antennas don't look like this. They look more like this. They have side lobes that look like sort of a bunch of bananas. And you can have high readings very, very close to the antenna, and you can have high readings where the antenna is actually incident with whatever it's touching, whether it's the ground or another building. That's why you might have higher readings further away from an antenna, depending on the elevation that you're at, rather than at some intermediate location. In 2004, in August, the International Association of Firefighters had a meeting in Boston where they passed Resolution 15. And this is what the resolution reads. The International Association of Firefighters opposes the use of fire stations as base stations for antennas and towers for the conduction of cell phone transmissions until such installations are proven not to be hazardous to the health of our members. So basically what they're doing here is they're saying the buck stops here. We don't want these antennas that can harm our workers, our members. These are the same people who rush into to burning buildings, who inhale toxic chemicals, but they simply don't want to be exposed to this form of radiation while they're sleeping and while they're resting, so that the cell phone industry can make money on top of them. Okay? So they've come out against this, and this includes the Canadian firefighters as well. This is really what the radiation looks like. If we were to see it, it would look like a fog. And that's why they call it in Europe electrosmog. It's very, very hard to avoid, and we're all exposed to it. What has been the reaction to wireless technology? I'm going to go through this very quickly. You won't be able to read everything, and I apologize, but it's just to make the point that I'm not a lone voice here. There are scientists and medical doctors around the world who are really asking for action, and a lot of countries who have recognized this as a very serious health concern. It's an emerging health issue, and Health Canada has simply ignored it. In Germany and Israel, they're restricting the locations of these antennas. In France and Taiwan, they've actually removed antennas. They've taken Wi-Fi out of libraries, for example. In the United Kingdom and in Russia, they're very concerned about school kids being exposed, and what they're basically saying is have kids stop using cell phones. That's just putting this radiation very close to their brains. In Europe, the European Union has asked for the precautionary principle. And in Canada, Lakehead University has Wi-Fi or wireless technology only in areas where they can't have wire technology. They are willing to pay the extra price to have wires so that students can plug in and use their computers, but they have to actually plug it into the wall rather than to have wireless. There's a Vancouver school board that has limited the distance of antennas from schools to about 300 meters. And in Charlottetown, PEI, just last year, I think it was, they opposed a cell tower that was going to be close to schools and daycare centers. So what these people are actually saying is the buck stops here. We are simply not going to tolerate this form of exposure when the health of our communities are at stake. Okay, let's look at some of the scientific studies. When it comes to antennas, the highest radiation is going to come from radar and broadcast antennas. And the studies are showing, this is sort of the bottom line of the talk, the rest of the talk that I'm going to give. The bottom line is that for radar and broadcast antennas, the safe distance is beyond 2 to 4 kilometers. Okay, now this will actually depend on the power of the transmitter and on the geography and of the site, but that's what the studies are showing. When it comes to cell phone antennas, there are health effects that are observed within 400 meters. And with Wi-Fi and WiMAX, we simply don't know. The research hasn't been done yet. This technology is rolling out as we speak. Okay, the first group of antennas I'm going to share with you, 3 different studies that have looked at either radio or TV broadcast antennas. This is a study done in Australia in 1996. One of the things you can see here is that we're dealing with distances up to 12 kilometers. That's called the reference zone. So distances up to 4 kilometers, the levels were 0.2 microwatts per centimeter squared. Very close to the tower, they were 8 microwatts per centimeter squared. Health Canada's guideline is actually 200 microwatts per centimeter squared for this frequency range. Okay, so they're well below Health Canada's Safety Code 6 guidelines. What they found for brain cancer, there was no increase in either incidence or the mortality. For adult leukemia, it was up by 24%. This was statistically significant. For childhood leukemia, it was up by 58%. It was statistically significant. And the mortality was up by 130%. So more kids were developing leukemia closer to the antenna, and a much larger percentage of children were dying from leukemia. Another study in the UK, 1996. This is now looking at radio and television broadcast. They studied a cancer cluster and found that adult leukemia was within 2 kilometers radius of the tower, was up by 83%. This was statistically significant. Bladder cancer, they found that this declined with distance, so the further away, the lower the probability of developing bladder cancer. And they found that skin cancer also decreased with distance, but they assumed that this was due to the socioeconomic status of the people, and that the richer people could go down south and they were exposed to sunlight. That was never that was just a confounding factor that the scientists assumed was responsible for the increase in skin cancer. And their conclusions was, no causal implications can be made from a single cluster investigation of this kind. So basically, they were passing the buck in this particular case, despite the fact that they found a higher incidence of adult leukemia. Italy, 1998, near a radio transmitter. Here what they found was that within 3.5 kilometers, there was an increase in the standard mortality ratio for adult leukemia. This is deaths from adult leukemia, and it was much higher in men. So there was a 3.5-fold increase in men dying from leukemia that were within 3.5 kilometers of a radio transmitter. Interestingly, leukemia keeps coming up again and again, so you think maybe just maybe there's something there with leukemia. Okay, it's not only people that are affected. These are 3 studies looking at animals. The study at the top was done in Italy near antenna farm where they have a lot of antennas. They basically did an experiment. They took mice and they exposed them to the radio frequencies at this antenna farm. And they simply mated them over time. And after 5 generations, the mice became irreversibly infertile. They simply couldn't conceive anymore. And that was at levels. Here you can see that was the maximum they got was 1 microwatt per centimeter squared. Okay, our guidelines vary from 200 to 1,000. In Germany, on a farm in Germany, they put up an antenna that had both TV and radio transmitters, and they found that the cows began to behave in an odd manner. Their milk production went down, miscarriages went up. They took some of the cows and actually moved them to another farm, and they improved. They brought them back, and within a week they were sick again. So it was something that happened shortly after these antennas were erected. And the last study was looking at stork populations in Spain. What they found is that the storks that were nesting very close to, I think it was cell phone antennas in this particular case, they became much more aggressive with each other. They spent much less time on the nest, and hence the number of fledglings they had was significantly reduced. So here there's a decrease in reproductive capacity of the stork population, a decrease in reproduction among the cattle, and infertility among the mice. So once again, there's a pattern that emerges from something like this. What about cell phone antennas? Well, there are about 6 studies, I think slightly more since I made these slides. 2 of them have shown an increase in cancers for cell phones that range from 3 to 10-fold and within 300 and 400 meters. So we're talking about roughly 1,200 feet. There have been a number of studies looking at electrical hypersensitivity, also near cell phone towers. These are the studies. Everything in blue show you what the symptoms are. I just want to draw your attention once again to the distances we're talking about, 300 meters, and to the power densities. At the bottom there, it's 0.4 microwatts per centimeter squared. For cell phone, it's 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared that Industry Canada deems to be safe. Okay, what are these symptoms of electrical hypersensitivity? I'm going to take one of the studies that we just had on the previous page. It was a study that was done in Spain in 2001, and all I did was graph the numbers that they provided in this particular paper. So everything in red here shows you the people who lived within 10 meters, or about 30 feet from an antenna. Everything in blue is from 10 to 50, all the way out to greater than 300 meters. Okay, so we're talking about different distances with the different colors. What we have here in the y-axis are the percentage of respondents who are experiencing symptoms very often. And what we have along the, I guess it might be the x-axis here, are the various symptoms. Now these are the order of the symptoms in decreasing order. So let's just take one. For fatigue, if you happen to be within 10 meters of one of these transmitters, about 70% of the people who live within 10 meters responded very often that they experience fatigue, compared to at 300 meters down to about 35% of the population. And we can go through this, for each and every symptom. The symptoms I have here that are the symptoms of electrical hypersensitivity, everything I've marked in red are the symptoms that we associate with aging. So I call it rapid aging syndrome. Okay? That's basically what we're experiencing. Our body's under a great deal of stress, and it's almost as though we were just aging. And indeed, that's the excuse a lot of people use when they suddenly begin to have this, difficulty concentrating. They can't sleep at night. They're tired. They have aches and pains, and they say, "Oh well, I'm older than I was last year, and I'm just aging." Put them into a clean environment. If their symptoms go away, it's got nothing to do with aging. Okay, what does the WHO have to say about electrical hypersensitivity? Well, in 2004 in Prague, they held a workshop on electrical hypersensitivity, and this is how they defined it. A phenomenon where individuals experience adverse health effects while using or being in the vicinity of devices emanating electric, magnetic, or electromagnetic fields. Whatever its cause, EHS is a real and sometimes a debilitating problem for the affected persons. Their exposures are generally several orders of magnitude under the limits of internationally accepted standards. So basically they're saying these people are much more sensitive than the rest of the population. They're responding to levels that we deem to be safe for the rest of the population. What does Health Canada say about this? Well, I had a look at Safety Code 6 very, very carefully. And on page 11 of Safety Code 6, it says, quote, certain members of the general public may be more susceptible to harm from radio frequency and microwave exposure. So they have acknowledged that some people are sensitive. They haven't done anything about it, but at least they've done that one step of acknowledging it. Okay, these are the symptoms of electrical hypersensitivity, and I'm not going to go over them because they were shown in the previous slide. How many people are affected? In Sweden, electrohypersensitivity is recognized as a disability. And if you go into a building where there's a problem, then the proprietor of that building has to fix the problem for you. So just like we have, wheelchair access for people who have difficulty walking, they consider this a disability. How many people are affected? The numbers vary. We think that probably 3% of the population has severe symptoms. These symptoms are so severe that they simply stop using computers. Many of them move to the country. They use minimal electricity. They can't go shopping because they become ill very, very quickly. And they've become electromagnetic refugees because there's very few places where these people can actually go in a developed country. Studies that have been done in the UK and studies that I've done in schools suggest that maybe 35% of the population has moderate symptoms. What this means is they might develop a headache when they're exposed to this energy, but they can still function, or they just don't feel really good, but they can go on. So their quality of life has been impaired, but they haven't been totally incapacitated. And then we think that probably 50% of the population is asymptomatic. They have absolutely no symptoms. You can expose them to any frequency of radiation, levels that Industry Canada deems to be acceptable, and they'll be fine. You just can't pick any symptoms up at all with them. Now, I've got some numbers for the local communities here. Sharon very kindly provided me with population figures. And so what does this tell us? Well, in Colwood, probably 460 people are severely sensitive. That means if they're exposed to this energy, this is how they're going to respond. And what about moderate sensitivity? Well, it's a third of the population. So we're talking about an extremely large number of people that are potentially affected by this form of energy. This is one of the key emerging health issues that's being documented globally, and we're simply watching it happen. We watched it happen with tobacco. We didn't act for decades. We watched it happen with asbestos. We watched it happen with DDT. We watched it happen with PCBs. We watched it happen with lead. The list can go on and on and on. We now have it for electromagnetic energy, and we're simply sitting there watching it happen. And there's a few people in the community, I know COS has been very active in this particular community, that are saying, look guys, this is what I'm finding. Could you please help? This is a very serious issue. In Canada, we're talking about 10 million people who have the potential to be affected by this energy. Okay, what about the guidelines? Well, Safety Code 6 is based on a 6-minute heating effect, averaged over 6 minutes. This is a picture of a building that I took when I was in Prague attending the World Health Organization conference. And what it shows you is that you've got these antennas on top of apartment buildings and office buildings. What happens to the people who happen to live immediately below these antennas? One of the figures I showed you is one of the highest levels are immediately below the antenna, and then at some distance away from the antenna. Well, there's all sorts of problems with the 6-minute thermal average. First of all, 6 minutes is too short a period, okay? We're not just dealing with heating effects. And even if we were just dealing with heating effects, an average doesn't mean anything biologically. Okay, let's have a look at this. Can a guideline based on a 6-minute thermal average protect the health of people exposed to microwave radiation in their homes, let's say 8 hours a day, let's assume that they go out during the day, 7 days a week and for at least 50 weeks out of the year? What time are we looking at? Well, 6 minutes versus 2,800 hours of exposure. Why does average not make any sense? You could tell that whoever wrote this particular guideline was an engineer because they like numbers, and average makes a lot of sense too. And I'm not trying to knock engineers, but that's how they think. When it comes to biological systems, it's not the average that matters, it's the peak values that matter. If you're running bath water and you turn on the faucet and you put your hand under it and it's scalding hot, right? So you automatically remove your hand. You then turn the tap down a little bit, and now it's a little bit too cold, and you turn it up. At the end of it, you're going to have a nice, warm, lovely, lukewarm bath. In the meantime, you've burned your hand because you've scalded it. If you look at tomato plants that are frost sensitive, if you have 1 hour of frost, in the middle of the night, even though the average nighttime temperature might be above freezing, that tomato plant is going to die. So averaging makes absolutely no sense from a biological perspective. It has to be the peak that something is exposed to, the maximum. Okay, does this guideline protect the sensitive population that Health Canada has recognized? I mean, it doesn't even protect the non-sensitive population that Health Canada has recognized. Okay, the game that we're actually playing here is pass the buck, and I'm going to tell you how the game is played. We have different players, and they represent industry and health. We have players at the international level. At the international level, we've got something called ICNIRP. This is the group that sets the guidelines for radiofrequency radiation. They consist of a bunch of engineers, physicists, many of them who have company industry connections. We also have something called the IEEE, which is a group of international engineers. Once again, very much physicist concept, very strong connections to industry. At the health side, we have the World Health Organization, as well as a number of other organizations. I've just used them as the key one here. And we have IARC, which is an agency that looks at cancer research internationally. At the national level, we have two groups. We have Industry Canada that maintains, sells the licenses, and then theoretically goes out and monitors this, although that doesn't really happen anymore. Actually, it never happened unless you request them to come out. And then we have Health Canada that determines what levels are safe. Okay, at the more local levels, we have the electric utility and the wireless providers. And under the industry and under health, we have ministries of energy. Provincially, we have local health units, that type of thing. So these are the key players that are involved. Now, you go to your doctor and you're not feeling well. You think that your illness might be due to the antenna that's been erected in your backyard because you were okay before the antenna was erected. Well, your doctor would look into this. Doctors don't have training in this, by the way. We're trying to educate the medical community now about this particular illness. But they would go to your, the provincial ministry, and the provincial ministry would then say, okay, this is really under Health Canada. It's a federal jurisdiction. So they go to Health Canada, and Health Canada will say, well, we're just following the guidelines of the World Health Organization. And then you go to the World Health Organization and say, well, we're just following ICNIRP's guidelines. Now, these are the engineers that basically work for the industry, okay? Now, let's assume you go to your electric utility or your wireless provider, and they say, hold on, we're within Industry Canada's guidelines, okay? So Industry Canada say, our guidelines are based on Health Canada, okay? We can't do anything about it. Or they will say, we're just following the international guidelines. This is how the game is played. And so really, these are the people who are making the decisions as to what you and I are exposed to. This is how you play the game, pass the buck. Okay, in 1999, Health Canada asked the Royal Society of Canada, now this is a very prestigious group of scientists in Canada. To become a member of the Royal Society is incredibly prestigious. They asked the Royal Society to review the guidelines because they were getting a lot of requests for antenna sightings. And they wanted to make sure their guidelines were okay. Their guidelines are based on thermal effects. This is what that particular review said about thermal effects. Radio frequency guidelines are based on thermal limits, Health Canada's Safety Code 6. Okay, we know that. Whole body exposure. There's no evidence that thermal effects occur below guidelines for workers or the general public. Basically what this means is the thermal effects are protecting you against heating if your whole body is exposed. Now the guidelines actually differ whether it's your whole body or just part of your body that's exposed. This is what they say about partial body exposure. They said the guidelines may not fully protect workers from the thermal effects associated with exposure to radio frequency fields. That's kind of interesting. You know, we don't hear about that very much. They then go on to say, therefore, local exposure limits for workers should be reviewed, both in terms of the level and duration of exposure. To my mind, the levels haven't changed for workers, so whether or not it's been reviewed, I don't know, but nothing's happened. They're particularly concerned about your eyes. The two parts of your body that are most sensitive to this form of energy are your eyes. You develop cataracts, among other things, and your testicles. Okay, that's only for half the population here, by the way. Your testicles cannot thermoregulate. You know, that's why we have funny things happening to men who go into the cold water and things like that, right? So your testicles and your eyes are incredibly sensitive to this. Why are we having problems with reproduction? Well, testicles are part of the problem of reproduction. Okay, this is what they say about non-thermal effects. Exposure to radio frequencies at intensities far less than levels required to produce measurable heating can cause effects in cells and tissues. And indeed, Dr. Martin Blank can tell you much more about this. These biological effects include, and they identify three of them. One is calcium regulation, the other is changes in the blood-brain, the barrier, the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, and the third is dealing with an enzyme that they find that's been associated with cancer. So they're saying these three things are affected well below the guidelines we have for Health Canada. They go on to say that non-thermal exposure levels of radio frequency can potentially be associated with adverse health effects. So they haven't ruled out adverse health effects. Okay, let's look at the guidelines globally. This is what Canada's guidelines are. Here we have power density, and then everything in purple here are various guidelines. These are how much the guidelines differ in different parts of the world. They vary 5 orders of magnitude. That's unheard of for any kind of chemical in the environment. When we set guidelines for lead, they're the same here as they are in the UK, as they are in the United States, as they are in India and China, because we all have the same sensitivity to this particular toxicant. There's nothing that tells me that the people in Sweden or in Russia are much less or much more sensitive and hence need to be protected better by their guidelines. So having guidelines that are 5 orders of magnitude different just boggles the mind. The reason for that is the high guidelines are based on thermal and the lower guidelines are actually based on the biological effects, so they've been following the literature in this area. Well, we took readings today in various locations. They go from A to F. The closest one is A, the furthest one is F, and these are the values that we actually got. So we exceeded Health Canada's, or Industry Canada's guideline in a number of the locations here. The closest house was within 38 meters that we were able to go into and measure. The levels, the highest levels we got there were 288. That's above 200, okay? Some of the other homes had very high levels, but still under the guideline. But here, home D and home E had levels of 275 and 455. Well, if I was living in those homes, I'd get Health Canada and Industry Canada to come out real quick and do a proper testing because they're exceeding the guidelines that have been set by the federal government. Okay, now the one thing I want to say about the guidelines we measured, we didn't measure the 6-minute average. We spent more time than 6 minutes doing the testing, but these are the maxima that we got because these are the things that should be monitored, not the average. And we also went to a school, and in the schoolyard we got levels of 8. So this is pretty low. Now, the best guidelines in the world are 0.1 on using the same units, 0.1. So every single one of them exceeded the 0.1 level. In my home, the readings are 0.000. So you shouldn't have to live with this form of radiation. These are, once again, different groups in the world, scientists, medical doctors who have come together, signed resolution after resolution, asking their governments not to use the ICNIRP, the internationally accepted guidelines, because they don't protect the health of people. And I was going to read to you from the German one, but I'm not going to do that because of time. And instead, I'm just going to skip to the end about what needs to be done. If you like to live in a healthy green community, then it's very important to recognize the potential harmful effects of electromagnetic exposure. You simply cannot assume that as long as we're within the guidelines, we're safe. That's just absolute nonsense. We have to monitor. We have to find out what people are exposed to. No one's doing monitoring, and if they do it, they don't do it properly. So we have to monitor radio frequencies in buildings that are near existing towers. That's where we start, but that isn't where we end. We have to prohibit cell towers, and that includes, certainly includes broadcast transmitters as well, but cell towers within 400 meters and broadcast within 4 kilometers. I mean, that's what the studies are showing, so at least let's follow the scientific studies. And we certainly don't want to have them anywhere near schools. We have to establish microwave-free zones for people who have developed a sensitivity. And things like schools, libraries, public transit should not allow people to use their cell phones because this form of radiation is actually making people sick. And finally, we have to establish biologically based guidelines for radio frequency radiation in Canada. We can't assume that there's no need for these particular guidelines anymore. This is very close to where I live. It's in Lakefield, just north of Peterborough. And I'm just going to end this with 3 quotes. One is that liberty cannot be preserved without general knowledge among people. If you don't know, you can't do anything. But as soon as you know, you've got an option of acting or not. That's really your option. And I'd just like to acknowledge CAUSE, and particularly Sharon and Dennis Noble for what they're doing, bringing attention of this issue to your attention. Facts don't cease to exist because they are ignored. We can't continue to ignore this information. The evidence is glaring us in the face. And here I like to acknowledge Health Canada, Industry Canada, the World Health Organization for ignoring the facts. Okay? The fact that they're ignoring them doesn't mean they don't exist. And finally, the buck stops here. And I have a challenge to Dr. Keith Martin, to Dr. Richard Stanwyck, who's the director of the Vancouver Island Health Authority, and to the cities of Colwood and Langford. You really have a responsibility, and you can step up to the plate if you so choose, or you can pass the buck. It's entirely up to you. But I'm certainly hoping that what you'll say is the buck stops here. Thank you very much.